Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas, Swarup. This is our 25th episode. And to mark this special milestone, we will be discussing a very special relationship. Last weekend, the Prime Minister of Japan, His Excellency Fumio Kishida, was in New Delhi to hold the 14th annual summit with Prime Minister Modi. And it provides us the perfect opportunity to take an in-depth look at India's special relationship with Japan. The friendship between India and Japan has a long history, underpinned by spiritual affinity, strong cultural and civilizational ties, and shared values. India's earliest documented contact with Japan took place in the 6th century AD and the arrival of Buddhism into Japan. At the invitation of Emperor Shomu, an Indian monk, Bodhisena, performed the eye-opening ceremony of the great Buddha in Todaiji temple in Nara in 752 AD. That set in motion a great cultural interaction between India and Japan that has lasted till today. In the post-independence period, iron ore from India helped Japan's recovery from the Second World War. And Japan started providing yen loans to India as early as 1958. Prime Minister Yoshihiro Mori's visit to India in August 2000 provided the momentum to strengthen the Japan-India relationship. He and Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee established a global partnership between India and Japan. During Prime Minister Modi's visit to Japan in 2014, the relationship was upgraded to a special strategic and global partnership. Japan is one of the few countries with which India has a system of annual summits starting from 2005. Today, as the two countries celebrate the 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations, India-Japan ties are at their peak. India believes that strong relations with Japan are key to stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Both countries are part of the Quad grouping, along with the United States and Australia, which seeks a region free, open, resilient, and inclusive. There are also various frameworks of security and defense dialogue between Japan and India, including the 2+2 Foreign and Defense Ministerial meeting, which was held for the first time in November 2019. Since 2015, Japan has become a permanent member in the annual Malabar naval exercise that India holds with the United States. Thanks to the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which came into effect in 2011, bilateral trade is expanding rapidly and crossed $18 billion in 2019. There are almost 1,500 Japanese companies in India and 11 Japan industrial townships have been established. Japanese investment in India has crossed $36 billion and is deployed in sectors such as automobiles, electrical equipment, telecommunications, chemicals, insurance, and pharma. India is the largest recipient of Japanese overseas development assistance, receiving over $26 billion between 2010 to 2020. Japan has been supporting infrastructure development in India, including the Delhi Metro, the dedicated freight and industrial corridors, smart cities missions in Varanasi, Ahmedabad and Chennai, and the 508-kilometer-long high-speed rail project between Mumbai and Ahmedabad, which is being financed with a 50-year loan from the Japan International Cooperation Agency. So the visit of Prime Minister Kishida came against the backdrop of all-round development of India-Japan ties. It also marked a number of firsts. It was the first summit between India and Japan after a gap of 3.5 years caused by the pandemic. It was Prime Minister Kishida's first overseas bilateral visit since being sworn in as Prime Minister in October last year. And for India, this was the first incoming visit at the level of head of state or government this year. During the visit, Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Modi held wide-ranging talks covering all areas of the India-Japan partnership, from economy to security cooperation. Prime Minister Kishida announced that Japan will invest $42 billion in India over the next 5 years. The two countries signed 3 agreements on cooperation in cybersecurity, sustainable urban development, and wastewater management. To discuss the summit in greater detail, I have with me 2 distinguished experts. Ambassador Deepa Gopalan Wadhwa has been a career diplomat. She was the first Indian woman to be appointed ambassador to the Gulf state of Qatar and later Japan. She has also been India's ambassador to Sweden, Latvia, and Republic of Marshall Islands. Dr. Srabani Roy Choudhury is Professor in Japanese Studies in the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, with a specialization in Japan-India economic relations and Japanese economy and management. Let me start with you, Ambassador Wadhwa. The India-Japan partnership is described as a special strategic and global partnership. So what is so special about this partnership and why is it so strategic?
Very good question. So when did we add the special to the strategic and global partnership? You know, it started as a global partnership and then we added strategic and then special. The special was added really in 2014 when Prime Minister Modi visited Japan for the first time as Prime Minister. And even before he went, he had said that his first bilateral visit outside South Asia would be to Japan. That itself shows why Japan was so special. Because I think in this century, it certainly is a relationship which has made a qualitative difference in the way both of our countries look not only at our bilateral relationship, but regional and global affairs. And, you know, we have established in these last 20 years or so, a huge superstructure, may I say, of dialogues with this annual summit at the apex, and which we've just had. We've had both our prime ministers meet, and then a very, very multi-layered cascade of meetings at the ministerial level and the official level. So I don't think there is really any such other relationship that we have perhaps with the US, but the fact that it developed so fast, the range of issues that are covered, the depth to which we go, the ever-widening relationship makes it very special. And why strategic? And strategic, I think, because we've realized that beyond the bilateral, that we have converging interests, both regional and in the global area, where both of us have common values. I think we look at the world, a lot of issues in the same way. For example, expansion of the UN Security Council, the many issues where we're together. And importantly, I think Japan and India do want to play a greater role in both regional and global affairs. And therefore, it makes the relationship strategic.
Professor Roy Choudhury, how do you evaluate Prime Minister Kishida's visit? And in what ways did it break new ground?
Kishida is not a new person to this whole activity. He's been the foreign minister, and at that point of time, India-Japan has inked the India-Japan Vision 2025. His visit out here, if you look at it, as Deepa Wadhwa said, that it was a global partnership followed by strategic and special. I think in each quantas, he has given us, this particular visit of his has given us new directions. As far as specialness goes, the amount of areas that has been covered in this particular summit, especially with respect to urban development, with respect to sustainable development, the Northeast, I think there's a huge amount of areas that we've covered. In the strategic component, I think both the leaders have discussed almost all the global issues that is confronting them and looking at how to secure the Indo-Pacific, both with respect to development agenda as well as with respect to strategic agenda. So if you look at it in one way, it has been an extension of what has happened so far previously to this summit. I think there has been an extension, but there has been new frontiers that has been discussed. Sustainable development, cybersecurity, outer space, I think these three areas would be the new defining areas with respect to development agenda between both the parties.
Ambassador Wadhwa, Prime Minister Kishida's visit took place against the backdrop of the escalating war in Ukraine. Japan has announced comprehensive financial sanctions to isolate Russia, including export controls on semiconductors and other high-tech products. India is the only member among the Quad countries which has not imposed any sanctions on Russia and has refrained from taking sides in the conflict. Would you say that the two countries agreed to disagree on Ukraine, or do you detect some convergence even on this issue?
I think we saw a lot of articles in the press before Prime Minister Kishida's visit that he would be coming to speak about Ukraine. It was, I think, it got more hype than it really required. Because, of course, when you're talking about global issues, this would be top of the agenda. And there's been a great churn in global affairs because of what has happened. So very naturally, we would expect both countries to discuss it from their own perspectives. But, there is a maturity in our relationship now. I think we are willing to hear each other. We don't have to agree on everything, and there are nuanced differences. However, I think what has come out in the joint statement between the two countries is very interesting, because it talks about both the countries expressing serious concerns. It talks about the conflict, doesn't talk about war or invasion. It talks about the humanitarian crisis and that both countries want to do something about it. It talks about our concerns about the nuclear facilities and the importance of the IAEA. And then at the end of it, of course, the joint statement says that we would like them both to end the violence and then come to the table, and dialogue, diplomacy is the way forward. Then I think this really in many ways reflects the maturity of the relationship. I'm sure we put before each other, you know, the way we were looking at it, both countries were, and you're quite right. I mean, Japan has had a long and close relationship with Russia, which it has put on really at stakes in the context of this conflict. You know, they have had issues because of those 4 islands. They wanted to sign a peace treaty. Prime Minister Abe and President Putin, you know, were meeting regularly at summit meetings. And I think all that has gone back, and there was an energy relationship between them. So they put all that, they've staked all of that, because I think perhaps as a part of the Western alliance, they feel very strongly about it. And also of late, they've been concerned about the growing closeness between Russia and China. And, you know, they've had joint exercises now, you know, in the immediate region of Japan, in the straits between the islands. So there are concerns. And therefore, they've come up with the whole panoply of sanctions against individuals, against entities, called their companies out, you know, much more than we saw maybe in the case of Crimea, where there were also some sanctions. But I think as far as the two of us are concerned, and you also talked about the Quad, I think in the Quad, we know the position of the other 3 countries. Maybe you do require a country like India in the Quad that is acceptable to both sides of the conflict. And maybe there's a special role for us there.
Interesting. Now turning to the economic side, Professor Roy Choudhury, economic relations between India and Japan have vast potential for growth given the complementarities that exist between the 2 Asian economies. What are the new areas of economic engagement between India and Japan?
When India and Japan moved into the global partnership, I think all of us actually focused on the economic aspect, rather than none of us actually had little feeling that we will go into security cooperation. In the economic agenda, if you looked at it, the strength was basically we had huge human resource, they had capital, we had a large amount of low-skilled labor, and therefore advantage to us if Japan were to come in with their investments. We started off well, manufacturing sector, automobile sector took off, but somehow, you know, the equation between both the nations at the ground level of private investments have been not as good as what we would have expected when we began, especially after inking the CEPA. The new directions in which this particular relationship with economic cooperation is going is, what is interesting is we are now heading for areas where India probably has an edge over Japan, especially in technological digitalization, as well as with cyber security, you know, hacking issues, etc. That is, we have a huge soft power, and it is in these areas that I think India and Japan are going to be engaging, and we already have few working groups that are working, including into one area that is new and not much talked about, is the blue economy, in which India and Japan are planning to work closely, because it has an opportunity to go into the third nation within the Indo-Pacific littoral states, and which is what I think one of the agenda of the Quad, that they would like to engage more in the developmental projects in the Indo-Pacific region with smaller countries, such that they can engage them better and keep the space free, open and inclusive. So this is the one area that I think the new areas that India, Japan are going to be engaging themselves in.
Now, flowing from there, you mentioned the Northeast. A decision was taken at the 2017 summit to establish the India-Japan Act East Forum to coordinate developmental projects in India's Northeast. Why did we choose Japan as the development partner for the Northeast, and how has this forum progressed over the last 5 years?
Northeast major reason is basically the connectivity that it provides to the politically significant ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific, and that is why it was mapped in as an area where we need to engage ourselves. Of course, rising China has its own reasoning also behind it. Japan, because I think we are most comfortable with this country as we engage themselves and deepened our relationship. What we require is infrastructure. The region itself has pretty similar geographical geographical similarities with that of Japan. It has hills, it has this terrain which is much more easily understandable by, and Japan, since it is into the sustainable development goals which it follows from the United Nations and has few states which have taken over this. So there is I think a larger role that Japan feels it can play, and we are much more happier engaging with them. Right now, the current summit level joint statement has come up with industrial competitiveness agreement, as well as focus on Northeast connectivity, infrastructure, healthcare, and also with respect to horticulture and forestation. So I think these are areas which are apolitical and would have a larger significance to this region, which is trying to integrate itself and become a region of economic growth.
And are we already seeing some impact on the ground?
Yes, there has been, especially with respect to infrastructure. There has been 2 road connectivity which has progressed well. There's a long bridge that is going to be between Choudhury area and Assam, and that is also on the way. It is engaging itself. And of course, there is a lot of thing with commerce and culture that has been talked about. Bangladesh and our neighboring region from there is also developing through JICA's ODA programs, and it is expected that these 2 areas will link up well to become a progressively economically engaged area of operations.
Ambassador Wadhwa, it is said that China's growing assertiveness in the Indian Ocean as well as the South and East China Sea is bringing India and Japan closer. Would you agree?
When I talked of the reset in relations in 2000, I think one of the reasons certainly was, certainly for Japan, was the growing assertiveness, both militarily and economically, of China. And therefore they were looking at a partner in Asia with whom they shared values of democracy and so on. But beyond that, if you look at these 2 oceans, which are really, it's an organic continuum, if you look at it, which we now call the Indo-Pacific, the fact is that both of our countries, Japan as a set of islands and we peninsula, are dependent very much on the waterways for our trade. So for India, it's about 97% of our trade, and for Japan, perhaps all of it. And not only that, because if you look at this expanse of water that we're talking about, from the Indian Ocean, so you start from the Mozambique Channel and of course the Persian Gulf, all the way up to Japan and beyond, of course, Western Australia, you're looking at an area which is also dominated by the energy security of the countries because of the energy supplies that flow through it. And both India and Japan, as energy deficient countries, are very dependent on these energy supplies. Therefore, this whole region, the security of the region, the security of the SLOCs, the sea lanes of communication, the importance of navigation, freedom of navigation, is also important in this region. And therefore, certainly, this is what has brought us together. But beyond that also, there are other reasons. If you look at ASEAN centrality, both Japan and India, we have a stake in the ASEAN, which is kind of forms a littoral of the South China Sea. You might think that India is away from the South China Sea, but we have very close relations with the ASEAN countries. And, we have exercises in that region. If you recall, we had an agreement in Vietnam to do some exploration for oil in that region, and we are now increasingly describing it as the global commons. And therefore, for us, the South China Sea is as important as as the Indian Ocean is for Japan. And we are certainly seeing, we all know this, that it's not only the worry of the balance of power shifting, but I see the balance of military power. And we are seeing the Chinese Navy actually, which has grown hugely in the last decade and a half. Its presence, a very heavy presence in the Indian Ocean. And therefore, I think these are concerns that we share, and that certainly is one of the many factors that bring us together.
And what are Japan's main concerns vis-a-vis China as far as the territorial dispute is concerned?
This is of course the East China Sea and the islands in the, the disputed islands in the East China Sea. So this is another common factor that we have, that both India and Japan have territorial disputes still with China. And China's threatening actions that we have experienced on our northern borders is just what Japan has been experiencing also in the East China Sea, with increased intrusions into their maritime space, and a very sort of threatening position taken by China. So besides that, there were many other issues also. If you look in the bilateral context, they do have a good economic relationship. But if you look at another threat that Japan faces, which is really North Korea. So, the missile the program of North Korea, which directly threatens Japan. It's completely, well within their range. And they do know that China has a lot of influence on what North Korea can do, and maybe some of the technology flows and so on. And therefore, these are the threats besides everything else, that Japan feels from China.
No, I think highlighting the North Korea angle was also very, very important. Professor Roy Choudhury, Japan will be hosting the next Quad Leaders Summit in the coming months. What are Japan's expectations and priorities vis-a-vis the Quad?
Interestingly, Quad has always been through a lot of incredibility, like whether it came to the first Quad, then it came to the second Quad, and occurs happened, everyone questioned whether Quad will continue. Currently, again, it was questioned because India abstained from following the other three alliance group. But I think currently, in Japan's priority would be again to bring back Quad as a center stage with respect to Indo-Pacific region. It will try to create an atmosphere of collegiality among all the 4 Quad members, and I think the entire process of Kishida's visit out here was also probably to move in those directions. As far as priority, I think again it will go back to the economics of it, resilient supply chain, which is a part of the Quad. It's also part of our bilateral concern. I think that would be another area that these 4 countries will try to figure out to create an alternative, which is a very important aspect within the domestically what Japan looks at. Japan's current Prime Minister has established a new ministry called the Economic Security Ministry, which in its 4 pillars that it has created has issues like supply chain, issues of partnership between private-public technical cooperation. So if you presume that technology is going to drive the next decade, and if you presume that technology is also going to be significantly attached to the national power of countries, I think the Quad nations would try to emerge as a consortium of technological power. And if that is the idea, I think that is another priority area that Japan would influence in this current Quad summit that we were going to engage ourselves in.
Vaccine development is another area where I think India and Japan are working together as part of the Quad.
Yeah, in part of the Quad, with respect to vaccine diplomacy, it has been said that the logistics of movement of vaccine from India would be handled by Australia. Japan would be essentially helping with the technological aspect as well as some capital. So also will USA. So this is basically, in a way, alternative to other kind of programs that is on in the world with respect to vaccine, reaching vaccine to larger people, larger countries and smaller countries. But what is the latest development is interesting, that they say there are enough vaccine now, but the countries are not demanding anymore because they have not been able to fulfill their requirement of vaccinating people in their countries. So I think the next bet is probably engaging by helping human resources to travel to these countries and helping with them to vaccinate their population. So,
Master Wadhwa, you also want to come in on Japan in the Quad?
Oh, well, yes, we've been working together, and I think the Quad, to begin with, I think the concept which came from Prime Minister Abe, which located and put 4 major democracies together. But from what was initiated at an official level and was kind of a talk shop, it's now really come into action, into tangibles. And I think there are about 7 or 8 areas which they have identified where we will work together under the Quad. There was the COVID vaccine development. There is, of course, critical technologies. There are several other areas where we plan to work together. There is connectivity. There is also funding of infrastructure in that part of the world. So you have an alternate to
the Belt and Road.
To the BRI. So there are very many areas, about 7 or 8 areas we've agreed to work together. And I think these working groups seem to be making progress. And supply chain, the resilience initiative also. So I think, the Quad, if we do go along the path that we are, where we're really looking at tangible outcomes, I think it'd make a lot of difference.
I'm glad you mentioned Prime Minister Abe, because not only is he seen as the person who gave the first blueprint of the Quad, but he was also someone who really instilled a sense of dynamism in the India-Japan relationship. And of course, he developed a very close friendship with Prime Minister Modi. Now, of course, we have Prime Minister Kishida. Do you see Prime Minister Kishida as continuing the legacy of Prime Minister Abe, or could he in fact even exceed it?
Well, you know what happens is success has many fathers, I always think. And I recall when I was in Japan, Prime Minister Modi continued to be a very active player, and he loved to say that he was the one who had transformed the relationship. And then you had Prime Minister Koizumi who had come in, and really the infrastructure projects had started in his time. But yes, we had a very special relationship with Prime Minister Abe. And this relationship, he claimed, went back to the stories his grandfather told him when the grandfather, who was Nobusuke Kishi, Prime Minister Kishi, came to India in 1958. And he had stories of India, and he said, I learnt of India in a very special place in his heart. And therefore, you find the story, the speech about the confluence of the two seas, yes, our inclusion in what was the Indo-Pacific. You must remember before that, we were not part of what was called the Asia-Pacific construct. We were out of it. That ended with the ASEAN. So, making us very much part of the economic dynamism of Asia. And then, of course, the Quad. So, Prime Minister Abe will really be remembered as somebody very special in our relationship, and there was special warmth. I must also say here that, while his relationship with Prime Minister Modi is much talked about, I was also there during his summit meetings with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And I think they also shared a very good relationship. And I recall that they gave Prime Minister Manmohan Singh the highest civilian award that they could. My point of saying this is not to say that, that he was more fond of one than the other, but to say that there is bipartisan support in Japan, and irrespective of who the Prime Minister is there or here. I think there's a great depth, maturity in this relationship, and which will certainly, it will sustain and it will persist. Prime Minister Kishida is somebody that I knew as the foreign minister at that time. Very different personality in many ways. I think a much more quieter, more circumspect prime minister. But then you see him taking very decisive action in very many areas. So I think the fact that he came here on his first ever visit, you mentioned that at the beginning, it was to India. The fact that he made sure that the summit took place, I think we will see much of the same, which means that we will see certainly a deepening of the relationship under Prime Minister Kishida too.
With that, we have run out of time. So a very big thank you to both my panelists. As they have explained, guided by the strong political will on both sides, the India-Japan partnership has made significant progress in the last few years, and there is increasing convergence of our political, economic, and strategic interests. The 14th annual summit has sent out the clear message that despite the pandemic, a new leadership in Japan, and new global challenges, India's ties with Japan remain firmly on track. That is all I have for you in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Till we meet again next week, good night and goodbye.